So, hey, Colin, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining me.
Sure, yeah, I'm glad to be able to talk with you today. Yeah.
Totally. So, you've started a kind of secular church. Would you call it a religion or a church, or is there a difference to you?
Yeah, I would call it a religion. That term certainly makes some people a little bit uncomfortable. Even for a lot of the people that participate, there's been a lot of debate over the years of whether or not we should call ourselves a religion. I think at this point I've kind of gotten everyone on board with why I'm calling it a religion. But it's still something that sometimes throws people off when they first encounter us. We're defining religion in a more anthropological way than I think is used in common conversation, where we're saying that this is a set of philosophies that are also coherent with traditions and rituals and symbology that's actively being practiced by a community. So it's more than just a philosophy, it's more than just a club. I think it is religion, but it doesn't have anything to do with God or supernatural powers.
Cool. And just at the top, what's the name of it and how can people find out more about it?
Sure. Yeah. So it's called Aratanism is the name of the religion, and the main organization by which we're doing Aratanism is called the Assemblage of Arate. So you can find more about it on our website, www.aratanism.org. Um, Aratanism is kind of a hard word, I think, for a lot of English speakers. So that's Areteanism is Aratanism. It comes from the Greek word arete, which is the word for the virtue of being excellent in all ways that a thing or that anything, including a person, can be excellent. It's kind of like the old army slogan of "Be all you can be." That's basically what arete is being all that you can be. You as you, me as me, us as a group of people together in all ways that we can possibly be awesome. That's what we want to be.
This is cool. So the reason I wanted to talk to you is because I'm writing a lot about loneliness recently, and it's something that I've been interested in for a very long time. And one of the suggestions that I had for people who either feel lonely or just want to have more connections or to deepen their connections, but especially to meet new people, was to go to church.
Hmm.
Um, and I grew up Southern Baptist in the Deep South, and I was in church, 3 times a week, Bible camp, like all that, like deep into it. And I haven't been in a long time to any kind of church. But I actually went to one of the churches that I attended a lot in middle school with my sister recently, and I had to leave. Like during the sermon, I was so angry. I just got up and left. And so it's also something that when I was in San Francisco, I was part of the sex positive community in San Francisco, and when I would talk to other people, especially people in leadership, about what I wanted the community to look like, I used the um, analogy of church. Like I wanted our community to function more like church, especially in the, taking care of each other way. And especially because I do feel like our community did take care of each other, but it was a little bit ad hoc. Whereas I feel like churches will often have like a sign up sheet or like roles and responsibilities that are like more clearly delineated, which I think can be really helpful, especially for people who maybe neurodivergent or like are less able to go based on like, you know, vibes who like kind of want things spelled out for them. So yeah, I was just kind of curious about like from my perspective, like I totally get like why you would want to create like a secular church or a non-superstitious religion. Um, but I'd love to hear like your journey, like where did this start? So just pick it up wherever you'd like to.
Sure. Yeah. Boy, I empathize greatly with the things you've described so far. Yeah, it is tough. I think that we're living in an age where we're experiencing this phenomena that I call fracturing, which is the fracturing of social connections, both at the micro scale and at the macro scale. That individual social connections are weakening compared to all previous eras, I think, but also nation states and their interactions with each other. That even the strength of the states themselves, that's also fracturing. That we're having this fracturing at all levels, and it's useful to put in some effort to try to attend an actual organized thing and to put some strength back into these institutions. But it's difficult when those institutions have got a lot of toxicity in them, when there's a lot of things that really weren't put there with any intention, and now we're experiencing some really negative consequences from these things. Um, so yeah, I think that we need alternatives, and that's what we're trying to provide. So to answer your question though of my journey with this, where did this come from? I guess the story really starts with the fact that I grew up Mormon, or LDS, Latter Day Saint, as they prefer to be called these days. And I was a true believer for a very long time. That was something that was very, very important to me. I really was 100% on board with the program, so to speak. I went and served the Mormon mission for 2 years. For those that might not be familiar, that's the annoying guys in suits that come around and knock on your door and ask you if you want to hear about the Book of Mormon. Yeah, I did that for 2 years in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And actually, it was a great experience. I really loved it. That had been my life goal for a very, very long time. Basically, as long as I can remember, that's what I wanted to do, was to be a missionary. And I really made the most of that experience in a lot of ways. So while I no longer agree with those things that I was teaching, I don't actually have a whole lot of regrets from the experience of going. So if we flash forward a little bit, while I was a missionary, my family apostatized from the LDS church. They decided they no longer believed, that they thought it was all a bunch of hogwash, and they also moved while I was a missionary. So when my time was up, missions are done 2 years to the day. When my time was up, I went home to a new city and to a family that had rejected the religion that I had been out there trying to convert people to. So that was a pretty intense transition for me. I mean, even just going from being a missionary to not is a pretty intense transition. That's a culture shock on its own. So I was kind of getting culture shock times three. And that was a real challenging process, but I'm glad that it happened because it ultimately encouraged me to deconstruct my own beliefs and to think a little bit more critically about how I had been raised. And so there was some stubbornness involved, I think in part because of how vociferous my family was with saying that you should leave, you should stop being a missionary. I was saying, no, this is who I am. I'm going to stick to this. But 3 years later, I ended up leaving the Mormon church on my own accord, after having really thought it through quite intensely for myself. I think that at that point, I went through a stage of being something of a militant atheist for a little while, which I think is a fairly common experience for people that go through some sort of deprogramming, I should be more charitable and say deconstruction, but I think you can kind of see what I feel about it, deprogramming. Going through that deconstruction experience, coming out of something, particularly an intense form of Christianity like Mormondom. I imagine similar coming from a Southern Baptist background. I definitely had a phase where I was really just very anti-religion, very anti anything that had even the whiff of that kind of behavior. So I apologize for not making this story shorter, but the next step is that after kind of meandering for a little while, I think in part from just how discombobulated my return from being a Mormon missionary was, I finally got my life back on track by joining the United States Marine Corps. So I did that for 5 years. So I was quite a bit older than most recruits are when I joined the Marine Corps, and that was definitely a significant part of my experience, was just being a little bit more mature. I won't say mature, but a little more mature than most of my cohort, and that was its own really interesting kind of religious experience. That the Marine Corps is very, very rigid. There's a common joke out there that there's only one actual branch of the military, because the Air Force is a corporation and the Navy is a cruise ship and the Marine Corps is a cult. That last bit of Marine Corps being a cult, it's kind of true. So I went from one cult to another cult. And while I was deployed to Afghanistan, I had the unique opportunity to be looking at America from afar. And I really love my country quite deeply. That's something that I've also been working to kind of deconstruct what is my relationship with the United States, try to deconstruct everything in my life. But I really have a very deep love of country. at this point, I think I've expanded to having a deep love of the world, but I do love my country, and being away from it 2013 to 2014 and looking at what the state of the United States was from afar, and in particular looking at things like politics, but also just sort of society and the way people were behaving and the way that social media was changing things. I came to the deep-seated conclusion that America was ill, that our country was really quite sick on a sociological level. And that was really painful for me as someone who loves, I mean, it's like seeing a loved one have cancer or something like that. I'm looking back at my country and I'm now getting the perspective to understand just how sick it is. And so I started to think, what can be done? Is there anything that can be done to save our country, or is there nothing left but despair? So I've had the good fortune of studying a lot of history in my academic education, and so I turned to history to say, are there examples of solutions? Are there times in history where a nation was kind of on one track and then they made an abrupt 90-degree turn? When has that ever happened, if ever? And it has happened. It's actually happened kind of a bunch of times, but it's really only happened under two circumstances: when the nation gets conquered, or when the nation develops a new religion for itself. And I'm not really interested in being conquered. So, so that kind of opened my mind up to, well, okay, I hate religion, but maybe I should consider the possibility that maybe what we need is religion. And the more I started to think about that, the more I talked about it with other people, the more other people convinced me that I was maybe in a unique position with some of my life experience, growing up Mormon, being a Mormon missionary, having the military background, a lot of the other jobs I've done, a lot of the other travel that I've done, education I've had, et cetera. That maybe I was in sort of a unique position to start something that could actually be a new religion for the future. And so that's kind of its own whole process. I'll breathe here and give you a second to jump in. I realize I've been rambling, but yeah, I'd say that I started thinking about the need for a religion in 2014, and then I finally became convinced that this was something that needed to happen and that maybe I should do in 2015. And then the beginning of 2016 is when I finally got convinced to actually take action, to not just agree it was a good thing that I should do, but to actually start doing it. So it was 2015 to 2016 was the design process for the bulk of what is now Aratanism. 2016 is when it went live. So it's been growing for almost 7 years at this point. There's definitely been a lot of changes along the way. I expect there will be a lot more changes to come, but that's the story of our history in a nutshell. So let me turn the time back over to you.
Yeah, there's a lot I feel like I can relate to in that story. I feel like certainly growing up evangelical, certainly preaching the gospel, certainly being super nationalistic and patriotic, and then becoming very disillusioned with my country after learning more. I mean, I just went to college. I didn't go to Afghanistan, but fuck, that's an intense bunch of stuff that you've had to go through, but I'm glad that you landed where you are. I mean, I don't know. It's obviously like, so I'm kind of interested in like two branches of inquiry. One would be, how do you not become a cult leader, do something that's going to be harmful? And
Right.
then how do you, and I guess this is like two sides of the same coin, is like, but then also how are you, or how do you plan to go out and preach unto all people? Like, how do you get new converts? Like, what's the plan for growth? Because I mean, the thing that's so brilliant and insidious about religion is like, what sucks about it is the growth mechanism, right? Like when you talk about, you have to infect other people with this mind virus, or they and you are going to spend an eternity in torment. It's motivating.
Right.
So without that kind of carrot and stick, like, what's the plan? Yeah, I guess so it'll be a two-part question. What's the plan for getting people on board? And then what are the safeguards for not having this to be something that, even if you have all the best intentions, like, gets out of your control, or, you get too much power and you get corrupted, or, any of the things that happen to religions.
Yeah, these are really great questions. If you don't mind, I think I'll start with the question of the safeguards, and then we'll talk
Sure.
about the growth second. Um, so this was a really key concern for me. This was, a huge part of what I had to get over between concluding that America maybe needed a religion in 2014 and in 2015 saying, okay, I'll work on designing one, was was convincing myself that maybe that there would be a safe way to do this. One of the things that we say quite a lot in our community is that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that's really so much of what we've been trying to do is to find what are the good parts, leave behind the bad parts. I think that for some of the initial design process, as I approach this question, um, I was thinking quite a lot about how do I make a religion that doesn't suck. And then I had a little bit of a brainwave about halfway through the process where I realized I was kind of asking the wrong question. But really, the more important question is how do I make a religion that is great? And that if I make a religion that is great, by default, it won't suck. And so I need to worry less about it not sucking and worry more about it being awesome. Um, One of our fundamental principles, we call it our zeroth tenet of Aretanism, is do not do not. So that's to focus on what we want rather than focusing on what we don't want, because there's a bajillion different ways to avoid things that we don't want, but that can easily just lead you into something else that is also not good. So focusing on what you
I'm
do
gonna,
want.
yeah,
Right.
I'm gonna interrupt you for a second. And I'm just gonna do that, and I'm sorry, but I that's something that occurred to me at some point as I was deconstructing, is that I heard so many people in church, in leadership, growing up saying, I've never smoked a cigarette. I've never had a drink of alcohol. I've never done any drugs. Like, I've never cheated on my wife. I've never had premarital sex. And I'm like, and like, what is that doing for the world? How does it
Right.
help me that you've never had a drink? Like, this is not what ethics should be. This is not what anyone should aspire to, is what you haven't done.
Mhm.
It's so like small and selfish and narrow and stupid. So I love that. Like, let's do. Like, let's not focus on what we're not doing. Let's focus on what change we're making in the world, how we're helping people, how we're making the world a better place. I love that.
Right. Yeah. I think that you're right. Oh, I haven't done this, I haven't done that is a very egocentric way of thinking about the world. And we really want to get to sort of higher levels of consciousness that are including more and more people in our perspective. As we make decisions, recognizing that we are connected to everyone, including past, present, and future. Even, I think that when we're informed by those connections, we make better actions, and that includes directing ourselves more in that do and not do not um, sort of mentality. So yeah, so that was a big paradigm shift for me in the creation process, was to focus on do. Um, there are of course exceptions. We can talk about that in a moment, but there are exceptions, and we're very cognizant of the way that we might have exceptions. But as a fundamental rule, the philosophy that we want to follow is that do not do not. So the other things that I think really matter in terms of safety mechanisms is really being very intentional with the philosophical core. So aside from our zeroth tenet of do not do not, we have three core tenets, and I'd say that these three tenets are essentially the three safety mechanisms. So the first one is be people of arete. That means be as excellent as you can possibly be, um, both individually and communally. And so having a very strong philosophical basis in that, I think, is an important safety mechanism. That if you are seeking to be the best person you can be, if you're seeking to be the best group of people that you can be, that right there does a lot to avoid problems. That it teaches genuine humility, to be willing to take correction and to make course adjustments as you go on. That we don't care about adhering to some concept of an ancient tradition, what we care about is being awesome, and we will make whatever changes are necessary to be awesome. The second one is seek greater understanding, and specifically endorsing the scientific method as the best way of seeking greater understanding. And so that applies both to the physical world, that if you're trying to understand whether or not the Earth is flat or not, the best way to find that out is through scientific interrogation. And lo and behold, it's not flat. But also that applies to our personal lives as well, that if you're trying to figure out what the best way to live as a human being, and specifically to live as you, not just a generic human being, but as yourself, the best way to approach that is, again, scientific investigation, evidentiary based, using logic and rigor. This is actually a much better way of approaching these kinds of questions. So that in turn helps us adhere closer to reality. And I think that is another really important safety mechanism, that all of our doctrines we feel are scientifically validated by the scientific process. If it ever comes out that they're not as validated as we thought they were, then we will change our doctrines to make them more scientifically validated. So yeah, I think that being in touch with reality really, really matters. I've come to really love this new internet expression of touch grass. And sometimes people are using that sort of as a pejorative of like, oh, you should touch grass. We have started as a community telling each other that, we should touch grass. And we say it as kind of a loving thing that like, yes, go touch some grass. And we actually even mean it kind of literally that, I think there's real value in going out and physically touching some blades of grass to get that better connection to nature. But I'm getting sidetracked. The point is being in adherence with actual observable reality is an important safety mechanism. And then the third safety mechanism is our third tenet, which is the intent of the law is the law. And so that means that rather than having dogmatic prescriptions for anything, we trust in the human capacity for reason. We trust in your human capacity for reason to make decisions for your life. So we don't have thou shalt or thou shalt nots. We really don't have thou shalt nots. I guess you could say we have thou shalts, like be a person of arete, I guess is a thou shalt. But the point is that how you do that is going to be up to you. And we have, more doctrines that we use to help specify this. We have a whole 6 qualities of arete and 30 aims of arete and all of these things. But you're the one that's going to have to make the decision of how to apply these things. And no one, not me, not, a fellow person in the congregation, no one can tell you what the right interpretation is. That's for you to decide. So I think that trusting people to make different decisions, that your decisions legitimately do not have to be the same as my decisions, that's another really important safety mechanism for why I was willing to put this into the world and sort of take the risk of like, what if this goes off the rails one day? I think that these safety mechanisms will do a great job of preventing it from going off the rails.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is there's a sexual abuse scandal rocking the Southern Baptist Church, particularly churches within the Southern Baptist Convention and Southern Baptist Convention leadership covering for known sexual abusers. And it is reminding me of, so again, my time in the sex positive community in San Francisco. And obviously, like as people who host sex parties, we had to deal with what we would term consent violations. And so these could range from touching someone without express permission to, a violent rape. And, there was a process, right, where, everyone who attended any of our parties was consent trained. Everyone who attended the parties knew who to get in touch with if a consent violation happened. There was a process for basically adjudicating accusations of consent violations. There was a process for dealing with people who were found to have committed consent violations, yada, yada. It's occurring to me that like every group needs this because consent violations are obviously not limited to sex parties. and they're not limited to sex either. And so I'm just curious about like, I think like what I want to see is in every organization, and sure as fuck the Southern Baptist Church is like have these policies and procedures in place, like consent train everyone in your organization, have a
Mhm.
reporting process that everyone knows what it is, have it be transparent, um, have a process for dealing with people who violate consent. Yeah, and so I'm curious about what you guys have set up in terms of, I guess that's like a very like long-winded way of asking like what's your accountability process, because yeah, like obviously like be excellent to each other is like a great, it's not a safeguard though, you know. Safeguards are in like accountability and things like that.
Yeah. Well, so consent is one of our core doctrines. I have to admit, I don't know if we have gotten that updated on the website. Consent has always been something that we have very actively talked about in our community, but it's only been sort of like explicitly recognized as like, oh yeah, this really is one of our core doctrines. That's only been this year that we've sort of made that formal acknowledgement, and I don't know that that has actually trickled up to the website yet. But it is one of our formal core doctrines is the concept of consent, and so everything, not just sexual consent, but every element of participation in our community is very consent focused, and part of our uh, the way that we practice in terms of meeting as a church, so to speak, is educating, kind of like Sunday school, except on arcane ideas, and so that includes education on consent. And so I think that that's an important thing. But the accountability is a separate part, and I'm glad that you brought that up because I agree that accountability has to be there too. And that is part of why we do have the assemblage organized in a hierarchical manner. I think that there's been really great talk in the last couple of decades now about sort of deconstructing the value of hierarchies. That I think that for so long people just assumed that hierarchies were the way to do things, and we've had some really good conversation as a society now about how some of the ways that hierarchies can fail, some of the ways that hierarchies can tend to certain kinds of problems. Um, but I think that at this point the conversation has gotten mature enough to realize that hierarchies do still have some usage. This is why they have been used for so long, is because they do actually offer some key benefits. We just have to be very cognizant of the dangers. But one of the benefits of hierarchies is accountability, is the ability to say, it really, the buck actually stops with you. You are the person who is responsible for ensuring the safety of such and such thing, whether we're talking about a sex party or whether we're talking about our introductory ritual to become an Aratan is to walk through fire. And we do that in a safe manner, but there is room for physical danger involved in that activity. And so having someone who's directly responsible to say, it's on you if this goes wrong. And so you will now put in the work to make sure that it doesn't go wrong because you don't want it to fall on you. That's actually a really important thing. And so I think that that same principle holds true for, let's just say that there was an incident of sexual abuse within the community, whether or not that involved people in leadership positions or if it was just amongst members of the community, having a hierarchy where we can hold people accountable and say, you really are the one that's going to pay the price for this. You agreed to be accountable when you took on this position. You're the one that has to figure out the solution here. Um, it can't necessarily prevent all instances of problems, but I think it does a lot to prevent many because people are taking more responsibility when they know that they're going to be held accountable. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I would say the point boils down to, is that knowing that I will be held accountable motivates me to behave responsibly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think hierarchy is useful. I guess I'm just curious about like, I think two things that have been very helpful for the sex positive community, and like, not that it's, there's no silver bullet, there's problems everywhere, but again, having a designated um, process for reporting consent violations. And then another thing that just occurred to me as you were talking is the biggest problem with hierarchy is that the people at the top become unaccountable. And so what some of our organizations did was they used people in other organizations that were tenuously tied to the organization as like accountability measure. So they would talk to people down in the hierarchy about how the people performing higher in the hierarchy are doing, to get an idea of like how, and that's what the Southern Baptist Convention is dealing with right now. Like they brought in outsiders to audit them and that's why we're learning about this stuff. So I was just curious if there are
Yeah, I think that third-party validation is a really important tool. I guess we don't have anything that's explicitly set up for that at the moment, but I think that's a good idea and something that we should. I think it's something that we would certainly always be open to, but maybe it's something that we should even proactively set some measures in place for that. I think that openness, that's one of our 30 aims of Arte. And so, all of the 30 aims of Arte, we believe that they not only apply to individuals, but they also apply to groups of individuals, including institutions, even the assemblage of Arte. So openness and transparency, I think, are also really key ways to make sure that people at the top of hierarchies remain accountable. Because you're right, yeah, that when they stop being accountable, then the entire benefit of that hierarchy is lost, and now you're only getting the negatives without the benefits of the hierarchy. So openness and transparency is really critical to maintain that accountability. I think that I think that being flexible is also important. Part of the reason why our third tenet is what it is, the intent of the law is the law, is to trust that not all situations are the same. And rather than creating blanket rules for every possible circumstance, it's actually better in most cases to trust people to be reasonable. And that if you trust people to be reasonable, they will be reasonable.
yeah, I think that's a really important distinction between like evangelical Christianity and what you're doing is this idea of like people are basically evil. People are like sin nature. It's like not accurate and not helpful.
Right?
We're
We believe
about to run
capacity to be awesome, and we believe that
totally,
really you just need an opportunity to do that. And
totally.
so there's constant negative talk of oh, you're sinful, oh,
Right.
tell us about confess your sins, and even the concept of sin, these are things that I think really hold us back from being as great.
Totally.
Yeah.
We're about to run out of time, but I did want to get to the portion where you talk about how you're spreading the word.
Sure, yeah. So I do believe that that is an important part of who we are, and ultimately what makes us different from other sort of secular kind of churches, or even churches that are sort of like quasi secular, say Unitarian Universalist. And I want to be very clear that we really don't see ourselves as being in competition with any of these other organizations or movements. We really see ourselves as allies. If you use a better fit for someone, great. Please, do what is good for you. That's what we care about, is having people be great. But I do think that that the nature of our religious structure and having an explicit principle of sharing our ideas with others, with doing some amount of proselytizing. Hopefully, we do it less annoyingly than say Mormons do, but having that actually be a thing that we intend to do, that we intend to grow and to share our message. This is important because we're not just trying to better ourselves; we are actually trying to better the whole world. Going back to that history story of how I came up with this, what motivated me to do this. It was based off of seeing the problems with the United States, and I think that those problems have spilled over, and there are problems in the entire world with how we're living. We're facing serious existential threats, things like climate crisis and AI risks and nuclear war and biological war, and even non-man-made risks, solar flares and all kinds of things. There's real risks to humanity, both at a biological level and at a civilizational level. If we're going to literally save the planet, and I know that that's kind of melodramatic to say, but if we're going to save the planet from these risks, we will need to actually create some unified movement on some of these key issues. It's not good enough to just be a good person. And I know that that's tough news to hear, but it's not good enough to just be a good person. You have to also help other people be good people too. And we believe that having a religious framework actually makes this much, much easier to accomplish. And I recognize that, again, for a lot of us who have religious trauma in our backgrounds, that this is hard. What I'm asking people to do is not easy. But I would ask people to frame it as we're asking for people to give up just a thimbleful of their independence in order to achieve a bucketful of change. That you could just be a good person on your own. I mean, there's so many awesome people out there who have never heard of Arcanism and probably never will. We're still a very small movement. We certainly hope to grow on a global scale, but we're small. So many people who are being awesome who have never heard of Arcanism, but that hasn't saved us yet. That person being awesome, that person being awesome, all these people just being good people on their own isn't enough, evidently, to turn the clock back on climate change. It's not enough to make sure that we're proceeding into the next generation of AI-driven social media safely. It is not enough, apparently, to permanently end the threat of nuclear war. We got to get a little bit more organized. We're going to have to sacrifice that teeny bit of our independence to say, oh, I'm not part of anything. Oh, I don't associate with movements. You can't put me in a box. We're going to have to let that go. We're going to have to make a sacrifice and say, actually, I've got an identity, and that identity is a human-centric, human-forward sort of identity of progress, of believing in my fellow human beings and trusting them to make their own decisions, and they'll trust me to make my decisions. But we are going to do this together to actually make real social change.
Yeah, I think we have a problem of being, on the one hand, we've got like a very tribalistic, top-down, unaccountable, like controlled ways, institutions for coming together. We've got like basically like religion, nationalism, just shitty ways to come together, or we have atomization. I think like in a lot of ways, this is the biggest threat to liberalism, is that humans are not evolved to be on our own. We're not evolved to be cosmopolitan. We're not evolved to be without external sources of meaning and belonging. And as long as liberalism doesn't provide any alternative to the existing ways that people are connecting with each other and finding meaning, it's not really going to have as much uptake as it could. And these nationalisms and superstitions are going to continue to have a huge hold on people. So I think that's the two things I like best about what you're doing are, yeah, I mean, I think you're helping to solve loneliness and you're helping to shore up liberalism, which I think are like kind of two of the most important things we could be working on. So anyway, it was wonderful to meet you, and thank you so much for telling me about your project. And I will link to the website in the notes, and I'll get this up shortly. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great. Yeah, thanks. It was wonderful talking with you, Kathy.
Awesome, Colin. Bye.
Yeah, have fun. Bye.